The racist HOA demolished my lake cabin while I was away. I pulled up to the property and the excavator was still running. My home reduced to a pile of splinters. The HOA president, Linda, stood there with a smug look and said, "People like you don't belong here." She thought I was just some guy she could bully. She had no idea who I really was, or that every fake document she filed, every fraudulent email she sent, was feeding directly into a federal case I was building against her in real time. She thought she was tearing down my house, but she was really just building her own prison cell. How do you prove a conspiracy when the criminals already hold all the power? Drop a comment with where you're watching from, because the payback in this story is absolutely legendary. The last 6 weeks felt like 6 years. Overseas, in a city with no name on any public map, my world had been a 10 by 10 room, stale air, and the hum of a server rack. The only thing that got me through it was the image of my cabin. I could close my eyes and feel the worn wooden planks of the deck under my bare feet, hear the gentle lap of the lake against the shore, and smell the pine needles baking in the morning sunday. It was more than a house. It was the one place on earth I had built with my own 2 hands, alongside my father before he passed. It was my sanctuary. So, when my tires finally hit the familiar crunch of the gravel on Lakeview Trace, a genuine smile touched my face for the first time in nearly 2 months. I rolled down the window, letting the clean, cool air wash over me. This was my retirement. This was peace. I was done with the noise, done with the fight. Or so I thought. I was about a quarter mile from the property line when I saw the dust. It wasn't the light haze of a car on a dry road. This was a thick, brown cloud, churning in the air just over the tree line where my cabin should have been. A cold knot formed in my gut. My first thought was a forest fire. But there was no smell of smoke, only the acrid scent of diesel fuel and freshly turned earth. I pressed the accelerator. The gravel spit and popped under the wheels as my truck rounded the final bend, and then I saw it. The scene was so wrong, so completely alien, that my brain couldn't process it for a full second. An enormous yellow excavator sat where my front porch used to be. Its massive metal arm, caked with dirt and splinters of my life, was frozen in mid-air. Half of my cabin was gone. Just gone. The solar panels I had just finished installing last spring were a mangled wreck of glass and wire. The stone chimney my dad and I had built, stone by stone, was a pile of rubble. The excavator's engine was still running, a deep, throaty rumble that seemed to mock the silence of the forest. The operator, a guy in a hard hat and a stained t-shirt, stared at me from his cab, his hand still on the control lever. It was 11:30 in the morning on a Tuesday, and my world was being demolished. Before I could even put the truck in park, a woman came striding out from behind the excavator. She was in her early 60s, with a haircut so severe it looked like a helmet, and a bright pink polo shirt tucked into stiff khaki pants. She held a clipboard like a scepter. I knew who she was instantly. Linda Palfrey, the HOA president. We'd had one brief, unpleasant exchange when I first bought the land years ago. Something about the color of my mailbox not being on the approved list. She walked right up to my driver's side door, forcing me to stop. I cut the engine, and the sudden silence was broken only by the growl of the heavy machinery. She didn't look concerned or apologetic. She looked annoyed, as if I were interrupting her. She tapped on my window with a perfectly manicured nail. I lowered it. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. She gave my truck, an older but well-maintained Ford, a dismissive look. Then she looked me over, and her lip curled just enough to see. "Sorry," she said, though the tone was anything but. This property was cited for abandonment. Per Section C, Paragraph 4 of the bylaws, the HOA took emergency control to handle the code violations. It was a safety hazard. I just stared at her. Abandonment? I had been gone 6 weeks, on a government contract. My neighbor, Mick, knew. I had security cameras, I had automatic bill pay. The property wasn't abandoned. It was secured. There must be some mistake, I said slowly. This is my property. I'm Darnell Rhodes. Linda flipped a page on her clipboard, not making eye contact. We have it on record as belonging to a Rodell Davis, she said, mispronouncing the name deliberately. Multiple notices were sent. No response. The fines piled up. Demolition was the final step. Her eyes finally flicked up to meet mine, and a smug little smirk played on her lips. Besides, she added, her voice dropping to a confidential whisper, people like you don't usually have property out here anyway. It brings down the standards for everyone else. And there it was. It wasn't about the bylaws. It wasn't about a fake safety hazard or a made-up name. It was about my face. About the color of my skin. In that instant, everything shifted. The shock and the grief that had seized me turned into something else, something cold and hard and clear. It was the same feeling I got right before a tactical breach, when all emotion drains away and only the mission remains. This wasn't just destruction anymore. This was a targeted attack. This was theft, wrapped in the cheap, ugly paper of racism. Linda Palfrey thought she was talking to some guy she could run over. She thought I was alone. She couldn't possibly know that she had just declared war on a man who had spent 30 years hunting people far more dangerous than her, using weapons she couldn't even comprehend. I said nothing. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't get out of the truck. I just reached for my phone, unlocked it, and hit record. I pointed the camera right at her face, then slowly panned to the excavator, to the ruins of my home, and then back to her. Her smugness wavered for a second, replaced by a flicker of confusion. The petty tyrant wasn't used to silent, documented defiance. She was used to shouting matches she could win. I didn't tell her I was federal law enforcement. I didn't tell her that her every word was now evidence, or that the clipboard in her hand was probably filled with forgeries I could dismantle in my sleep. Not yet. First, you let the enemy think they're winning. You let them build their own cage, and I was going to make sure hers was airtight. 6 weeks earlier, the morning I left was cool and clear. A light mist was rising off the lake as I did my final walkthrough. Everything was in its place. The tools in the shed were cleaned and oiled, the storm shutters were secured, and the solar system was set to a low-power monitoring mode. I triple-checked the locks on the doors and windows from a small, discreet panel by the door. I armed the security system. It wasn't just a simple alarm. It was a network of high-definition, motion-activated cameras covering every angle of the property, all feeding to an encrypted cloud server I could access from anywhere on the planet. It was professional grade. Overkill for a lake cabin maybe, but old habits die hard. My last stop was next door. Mick was on his porch, cleaning a fishing reel, his prosthetic leg propped up on a stool. Heading out, Darnell? He asked without looking up, his voice a familiar gravelly rumble. Just for a bit, Mick, I said, leaning on the railing. About 6 weeks. Government thing, can't say much. He nodded, understanding completely. You need me to keep an eye on the place? I'd appreciate it, I said. Systems on, but another set of eyes never hurts, he grunted. Don't you worry. I'll make sure no squirrels try to declare squatters' rights. We shared a small smile. He knew, and I knew, that my property was occupied, cared for, and temporarily vacant for a legitimate reason. It was an undisputed fact between two men who trusted each other. As I drove away, I felt secure. The cabin was buttoned up tight. My neighbor was watching. What could possibly go wrong? It turns out, the conspiracy against me began less than 48 hours after my truck left that gravel road. As I would later piece together from digital breadcrumbs and HOA records, the first move was laughably petty. A notice was taped to my front door for a code violation. The offense? My trash receptacle was allegedly left at the curb for more than 24 hours after pickup. It was a lie, of course. My security footage would later show the sanitation truck running 2 days late and Linda Palfrey herself walking onto my property to tape up the notice just 3 hours after it was finally emptied. That was the seed. From there, the weeds of their plan grew with calculated speed. A week later, another notice appeared. Overgrown vegetation near the property line. Another lie. I had the whole half-acre professionally landscaped 2 months prior. The fines started piling up immediately. $50 a day for the trash can, $100 for the weeds. But this wasn't about money. It was about building a fraudulent paper trail. They needed to manufacture a crisis. The real heart of the deception was a letter Linda drafted with her quiet, compliant secretary, Elaine Stover. It wasn't addressed to me. It was sent directly to the county inspector's office. The letter was a masterpiece of subtle fraud. It claimed that the property at 114 Lakeview Trace was abandoned. It cited the trumped-up violations as evidence of neglect. But the most crucial part was the name. They didn't use my name, Darnell Rhodes. Instead, the letter stated the owner was Rodell Davis. It was a deliberate, poison pill typo. Close enough to seem plausible, but different enough that any official search of tax records or deeds would come up empty, reinforcing their narrative that the owner was unknown or had vanished. They were building a ghost to haunt my property. To give their lies the weight of official procedure, Linda and Elaine fabricated minutes from an HOA emergency board meeting, a meeting that never took place. The minutes, which I later obtained, documented a fake unanimous vote authorizing the board to take all necessary measures to resolve the hazardous conditions at the abandoned Davis property. They were voting in a vacuum, creating a legal fantasy to justify a crime. The final piece of the puzzle was the most insidious. The county, following its own procedures, attempted to contact the owner. They sent official notices, warnings about the pending demolition order. But they didn't send them to me. Linda had provided them with a contact email address she had created just for this purpose, something generic and untraceable, like R. Davis, homeowner, @mail.com. Every official warning, every last chance to intervene, went directly into a digital black hole that she controlled. From the county's perspective, they were doing their due diligence. They sent the warnings. They got no response. They were being expertly manipulated by a system of interlocking forgeries. While I was 7,000 miles away, running a cyber forensics operation in a secure facility, my own identity was being erased and replaced by a phantom they had invented to steal my home. The fines kept accumulating, a ticking clock adding false urgency to their manufactured crisis. They had the notices, the fake minutes, the unanswered county emails, and a fabricated story of a derelict property. All that was left was the final stamp of approval, the one document that would turn their criminal conspiracy into a legally sanctioned act of destruction. The county demolition permit? Linda forged that too. After the local sheriff's deputy took my initial statement and told me it was a civil matter, I didn't go back to the property. There was nothing for me there but a pile of memories reduced to splinters. Instead, I drove to the nearest town and checked into a nondescript motel with a reliable internet connection. I bought a coffee from the lobby, sat down at the small desk in my room, and opened my laptop. The rage was still there, a hot coal in my chest, but I packed it away. Rage is an accelerant. It makes you burn fast and bright, but it also makes you burn out. What I needed now was the cold, slow burn of focus. My career had taught me that the loudest person in the room is usually the weakest. The real power comes from being the most prepared. And Linda Palfrey had no idea how prepared I was about to become. My first step was to access the fortress I had built in the cloud. I opened a secure browser, navigated through 3 layers of password protection, and entered the server for my camera system. I went back 6 weeks and began to watch. The footage was crystal clear, time-stamped down to the millisecond. There it was. Day 2 of my absence, 10:15 a.m. Linda Palfrey's white SUV pulls up. She gets out, walks directly onto my porch, and tapes a piece of paper to my door. The trash can violation. I fast-forwarded. 3 days later, another visit. This time she tapes a second notice, for the weeds. But then she does something remarkable. After taking a picture of the 2 notices on my door, with her phone no doubt for her fraudulent evidence file, she carefully peels both of them off, folds them, and takes them with her. It was breathtakingly brazen. She wasn't just issuing bogus fines. She was actively removing any evidence that I might have been notified. She was ensuring my ignorance to build her case for abandonment. I downloaded the clips, saved them to 3 separate encrypted drives, and made a note of the exact date and time. Then I scrolled through the logs. Her car was there at least a dozen times. But then I saw someone else. It was a man, 40-something, wearing a cheap-looking security vest. On week 4, at 3:30 p.m., the footage shows him walking up to my shed, fiddling with the lock, and then returning with a pair of long-handled bolt cutters. The camera angle wasn't perfect, but the audio picked up the distinct snap of the padlock being cut. He went inside for less than a minute and came out empty-handed. He wasn't stealing. He was trespassing. He was establishing a pattern of unauthorized access. My next call was to Mick. He picked up on the second ring. I didn't tell him everything, just that there was a serious problem with the HOA. I asked him if he'd seen anything unusual while I was away. There was a pause. "Knew it," he grumbled. "That HOA security fella, Brad, drives around in that ridiculous getup like he's Secret Service. Saw him messing around by your shed a few weeks back. Had bolt cutters. Figured you'd asked him to check on something, but it felt wrong. He had the guy's name, Brad. I thanked him, told him I'd be in touch, and asked if he'd be willing to sign a written statement of what he saw." "In a heartbeat," Mick said, and the conviction in his voice was a small comfort. I now had video evidence of Linda tampering with notices and audio-visual proof of her enforcer illegally entering a locked building on my property. Next, I went to work on the paperwork. I used a public records search to pull the official property deed. My name, Darnell Rhodes, was spelled correctly. There was no Rodell Davis associated with my land in any capacity, past or present. I pulled the HOA's articles of incorporation and their publicly filed bylaws. I read every line, looking for the procedures they claimed to be following. There were rules for fines and notices, but they required certified mail for anything involving potential liens or property seizure. Certified mail leaves a paper trail. A piece of tape on a door does not. To preserve the evidence, I used an old field agent trick. I printed out the time-stamped screenshots from the videos. I printed the property deed, the HOA bylaws, and a summary of Mick's testimony. I put it all into a large manila envelope, sealed it, and drove to the post office. I mailed it to myself at the motel's address, with tracking and signature required. A federally postmarked sealed envelope is a time capsule. When I received it, I wouldn't open it. It would serve as untamperable proof of the exact date I possessed this evidence, creating an unbreakable link in the chain of custody. As I worked, the image of my father kept coming to mind. I remembered the summer we laid the foundation, mixing concrete by hand until our arms ached. He taught me how to measure twice and cut once, how to drive a nail straight and true. "You build something right," he'd told me, wiping sweat from his brow. "It'll stand longer than you will." They hadn't just torn down wood and stone. They had torn down his legacy, my legacy. That thought settled the last of my anger into a solid core of purpose. The final piece of the puzzle for that first week was the demolition order itself. Linda had waved it in the face of the excavator operator, a flimsy shield of false authority. I had the permit number from the copy the sheriff's deputy had given me. A quick search online led me to the retired county inspector, a man named George Ballard. It took me 3 calls to find a working number for him. When I reached him, he sounded tired. I introduced myself, and explained the situation. "Lakeview Trace?" he said. "Yeah, I remember the HOA president, Linda. Called all the time. A real piece of work." I gave him the permit number. "George," I said calmly, "I have a demolition order with your signature on it from 4 weeks ago." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Son," he finally said, his voice hard as iron, "I've been retired for 6 months. I haven't signed a permit all year. Whatever you're holding is a fake." My heart hammered in my chest, but I kept my voice steady. "Would you mind checking that number in the county system for me anyway, just to see what it says?" I heard him typing on a keyboard. Another pause. "Well, that's something," he said, a note of disbelief in his voice. "I just ran it through the public portal." I leaned forward, holding my breath. "That permit number? It doesn't exist. I had them on trespassing, property damage, and forgery. A prosecutor could build a solid case with what I already had. But a solid case wasn't enough. I needed an airtight one. I needed to prove not just what they did, but why they did it. Linda's racist comment at the scene was my word against hers. To a jury, it could be spun as a misunderstanding, a heated exchange. I needed her to admit her motive in a way she couldn't deny. I needed her own words in black and white. It was time to set a trap. From a technical standpoint, it was simple. I used a public terminal at the library to purchase a prepaid debit card and a disposable phone number. Then, I registered a new, anonymous email address. I became Robert Peterson, a concerned potential buyer looking at a property in the Lakeview Trace development. My online persona was carefully crafted. Slightly older, a retiree from out of state, financially secure, and very particular about community standards. I spent an hour reading public forums about the area, picking up local jargon and common concerns to make my story believable. Then I drafted the email. I sent it directly to the general inquiry address listed on the HOA's outdated website, an address I was certain Linda or Elaine monitored personally. The subject line was intentionally vague. Question from a prospective homeowner. In the email, Robert explained that he was very interested in buying a lot, but had noticed a demolished property near the lake during a recent drive-through. He was concerned. "We're looking for a quiet, well-maintained community," I wrote, "and a derelict or abandoned home is a big red flag for us. Could you please shed some light on the situation at 114 Lakeview Trace? We need to know if the HOA is proactive in handling these sorts of issues before we commit to buying." The bait was set. I wasn't accusing them of anything. I was posing as their ideal resident, a wealthy, compliant busybody, and asking for reassurance. I was giving them the opportunity to brag about their dirty work, to frame their crime as a noble act of civic duty. Then I closed my laptop and waited. For 48 hours, nothing happened. I spent the time organizing my files, creating a detailed timeline of events, and transcribing my video evidence. On the morning of the third day, a notification pinged in my anonymous inbox. The reply was from Linda Palfrey herself. My pulse quickened as I opened it. It was better than I could have hoped for. "Dear Mr. Peterson," she began, her tone oozing with condescending professionalism. "Thank you for your inquiry. Please rest assured, the situation you observed has been decisively handled. The property in question was abandoned for quite some time and had fallen into severe disrepair, creating a significant safety and aesthetic issue for our community." She went on to detail the fake code violations and the non-existent board vote, painting a picture of diligent oversight. But the final paragraph was the payload. It was the confession I was hunting for. "Frankly," she wrote, "it's not just about code enforcement. We are working very hard to maintain certain community standards here. The previous owner was not a good fit for our neighborhood, and we are confident that removing the structure will ultimately elevate the property values for everyone. This is a standards issue." I read the sentence 3 times. A standards issue. It was the perfect corporate speak for her bigotry. She had just admitted in writing that the demolition was not about safety or bylaws. It was a targeted removal of an unfit person to enforce her version of community standards. I immediately saved the email, headers and all, to my encrypted drives. The email header contained the IP address of the sender, the specific mail servers it routed through, and a unique digital fingerprint. It was a receipt for her prejudice. To validate my findings, I called in a favor. Marcus Cole was a retired FBI cybercrimes analyst who now ran his own private digital forensics firm. We'd been through a few ugly cases together, and there was no one I trusted more. I sent him the email file, the video clips, and a brief summary of the situation. He called me back 2 hours later. "Darnell," he said, and I could hear the grim smile in his voice, "this isn't just a smoking gun, this is the whole damn arms factory." The IP address on that email traces back to a residential account registered to Linda Palfrey. The metadata on the photos of the notices she took on her phone is all their time, date, GPS coordinates pinning her on your property. This is textbook forgery, fraud, and a clear violation of fair housing laws. He confirmed that the evidence was clean, the chain of custody I was building was solid, and that any decent lawyer could have a field day with it. My evidence binder was now overflowing. My flash drive was a ticking time bomb. Just as I was about to thank Marcus, an official-looking envelope was slipped under my motel room door. It was from the Lakeview Trace HOA. Inside was a bill for $12,500. It was a special assessment fine for unauthorized security surveillance on HOA common property. They were fining me for recording them committing a crime against me. The audacity was stunning. But it was also a gift. It was another piece of paper for my file. Another act of malicious prosecution that showed their state of mind. They were bullies, backed into a corner and getting sloppy. I took the bill, placed it neatly on top of the pile of evidence, and smiled. They thought they still held all the cards. It was time to show them who I really was. The next HOA meeting was held in a sad little community clubhouse that smelled of stale coffee and pine sol. I arrived 10 minutes early, dressed in a simple button-down shirt and slacks. I carried a single, thick binder under my arm. There were about 30 residents scattered in folding chairs, mostly retirees. At a long table at the front sat the board, Linda Palfrey, looking imperious in the center. Elaine Stover to her right, shuffling papers with an air of immense self-importance. And a couple of meek-looking men who nodded along to everything Linda said. Brad, the security guy, stood by the door, his arms crossed over his chest, trying his best to look intimidating. No one paid me any mind. I was just a new face, another resident to be ignored. I took a seat in the back row and opened my binder on my lap, arranging my documents in the precise order I would need them. I just sat there, quiet and patient, a ghost at their feast. The meeting droned on with the usual business. Complaints about lawn ornaments, a debate over the budget for new pétanque balls, a stern reminder about parking regulations. Linda ran the meeting like a petty dictator, shooting down questions and steamrolling any dissent. I watched the faces in the crowd. I saw frustration, resignation, and a lot of weary silence. These people weren't happy, but they were beaten down. They had learned that speaking up only got you a fine or a nasty letter. Finally, after an hour of tedium, Linda announced, "That concludes our new business. We have a 5-minute public comment period. Does anyone have anything to add?" A heavy silence fell over the room. No one moved. This was the moment they usually wrapped things up. Seeing no one, Linda began, a satisfied smile on her face. It was my cue. I stood up. "I have something," I said, my voice calm but clear, cutting through the silence. Every head in the room turned to look at me. Linda's smile froze. She squinted, recognizing me from the demolition site. "You," she said, her tone dripping with disdain. "You're not a member in good standing. You're delinquent on your fines. You have no right to speak." "Actually," I replied, walking slowly toward the front of the room. My dues are paid in full. As for the fines, we'll get to those. I placed my binder on a vacant chair in the front row and opened it. I looked not at Linda, but at the other residents. My name is Darnell Rhodes. I own the property at 114 Lakeview Trace. Or rather, I used to. A ripple of murmurs went through the crowd. This was the abandoned house. I held up the first document, a large printout of my property deed. This is the deed to my land. As you can see, the name is Darnell Rhodes. There is no Rodell Davis associated with my property. That was the first lie. I placed it on the table. Linda's face was turning a blotchy red. "This is not the proper forum for this," she sputtered. I ignored her and picked up the next exhibit, a series of time-stamped photographs from my security camera. "This," I said, holding up a clear shot of Linda taping a notice to my door, "is a picture of Miss Palfrey trespassing on my property to issue a bogus violation. And this," I added, holding up the shot of her removing the same notice hours later, "is her removing it to ensure I would never see it." This happened multiple times. The whispers in the room grew louder. People were leaning forward in their seats. "She built a case for abandonment by hiding the evidence," I stated plainly. Next, the demolition permit. I held up the forged document. This permit was supposedly signed by the county inspector George Ballard. I spoke with Mr. Ballard. He retired 6 months ago. The county has confirmed this permit number does not exist in their system. This is a felony. Linda shot to her feet. "This is slander. These are fabricated documents. Security, remove him." Brad took a hesitant step forward, but he stopped as several of the older men in the audience turned and glared at him. He was a bully, but he wasn't stupid. He wasn't going to manhandle me in front of 30 witnesses. "It's not slander when it's true," I said, my voice never rising. "And the best part is, you admitted to it all." I pulled out my phone and a small Bluetooth speaker. "The board claims the demolition was a matter of safety and bylaws. But here's an email Miss Palfrey sent to a prospective homeowner just last week, explaining the real reason." I placed the speaker on the table and hit play. A text-to-speech app read Linda's own words in a flat, robotic voice. "It's not just about code enforcement. This is a standards issue." The room fell dead silent. Everyone understood what that meant. Just as the silence became unbearable, I played one final thing. It was the audio from my phone on the day I arrived. Linda's voice, tinny but unmistakable, filled the room. "People like you don't usually have property out here anyway." A collective gasp went through the audience. Her racism, her motive, was laid bare for everyone to hear. Elaine Stover looked like she had seen a ghost. The other board members stared at the table, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. In the back of the room, a woman I didn't know was holding up her phone, recording the whole thing. It turned out she was a stringer for the local paper. The board started scrambling, whispering furiously to each other. Linda tried to shout over the commotion, but her authority was gone, shattered in the space of 3 minutes. I looked her directly in the eye. "You thought I was just some guy. You thought I was alone." I gestured to the stunned faces of her neighbors, the residents she had lorded over for years. "I'm not." The HOA meeting detonated a bomb in our quiet lakeside community. The local news story, complete with a cell phone video of my presentation, ran on the evening news and was the front page story of the paper the next morning. Suddenly, the phone in my motel room started ringing. It was other residents. One woman had been fined thousands for the color of her garden gnomes. An elderly man had been threatened with a lien because his oak tree dropped leaves into a common area. For years, they had all suffered in silence, thinking they were alone. Now, they had a voice. Now, they had hope. The first official domino fell the next day. I received a call from a lead investigator at the county building department. He had seen the news story, and my evidence package, which I had forwarded to his office that morning, was sitting on his desk. He was apologetic and furious. "Mr. Rhodes," he said, his voice tight with anger, Permit fraud is one of the most serious offenses we deal with. It undermines the safety and integrity of our entire system. We are opening a full criminal investigation into this matter, starting with Miss Palfrey and Miss Stover. Linda, however, was a creature of pure hubris. Cornered and exposed, she didn't retreat. She doubled down. The HOA's lawyer, a slick operator from a downtown firm, sent out a defiant press release. It called my accusations baseless and a smear campaign by a disgruntled property owner. Linda refused to step down as president. In her mind, admitting fault was a greater sin than committing the crime itself. She called for another emergency board meeting, this time a closed session, no doubt to circle the wagons and intimidate the other board members into silence. That was her final mistake. She assumed the fight was still at the local level, a game of bylaws and county ordinances. She couldn't comprehend that I had already moved the battle to a field where she was hopelessly outmatched. I made one more phone call. This one was to an old contact, a man I had worked with on a multi-agency task force years ago, who was now a senior deputy in the state attorney general's office. I didn't ask for a favor. I didn't need to. I simply laid out the facts. Criminal trespass, wire fraud based on the emails, felony document forgery, and a clear, documented case of racial discrimination in housing, a major civil rights violation. It's all on a silver platter for you, I told him. Every piece of evidence is logged, verified, and ready to go. He listened patiently, asked a few pointed questions, and then said, "Thank you, Darnell. We'll take it from here." Exactly 1 week later, on a sunny Thursday afternoon, the other shoe didn't just drop, it crashed through the ceiling. I was meeting with Mick on his porch when 2 vehicles pulled up to the little community clubhouse, a county sheriff's patrol car and an unmarked black sedan. 2 sheriff's deputies got out of the first car. A man and a woman in sharp business suits, investigators from the Attorney General's office, emerged from the second. They walked directly into the clubhouse, where Linda was in the middle of her closed-door emergency meeting. Mick and I watched from a distance. We couldn't hear what was being said, but we saw the panic. One of the timid board members opened the door and scurried away, his face pale. A few minutes later, Linda Palfrey was escorted out in handcuffs. The smirk was gone. The imperious posture was gone. She looked small, old, and terrified. As they walked her to the patrol car, her eyes scanned the street and locked on me. There was no hatred in her gaze, just a kind of blank, horrified disbelief. It was the look of a person who has spent their entire life believing they were untouchable, only to suddenly and violently discover the laws of gravity to apply to them, too. I gave her a slow, deliberate nod. It wasn't triumphant. It was simply an acknowledgement, an ending. The arrest warrant, which became public record the next day, laid out 4 felony counts: fraud, for creating a scheme to unlawfully seize property; falsifying official documents, for the forged permit and board minutes; criminal trespass, for the repeated unauthorized entries onto my land; and a state-level charge for housing discrimination. Elaine Stover was arrested at her home later that day. She crumbled immediately, offering to cooperate fully in exchange for a plea deal. The reign of the Lakeview Trace HOA was over. As the patrol car pulled away, Mick turned to me. "I always warned her," he said, his voice low. "You can't vote against gravity." His words hung in the air, a perfect epitaph for a petty tyrant. The power she had craved, the control she had abused, had all been an illusion. She hadn't been fighting me. She had been fighting the simple, unchangeable truth, and the truth had finally won. With the arrests made and the conspiracy broken, I looked at the pile of rubble where my home once stood. The emotional payoff wasn't about revenge. It was about clearing the ground, making way for what came next. "Now," I said to Mick, a feeling of clean, quiet purpose settling over me. "Now, let's talk about restitution." The criminal case against Linda Palfrey moved with surprising speed. mostly because the evidence was so overwhelming it was less a case and more a foregone conclusion. Facing the full weight of the state attorney general's office, she eventually pleaded guilty to the forgery and fraud charges in exchange for the state dropping the others. She received a sentence of 2 years, with all but 6 months suspended, plus a hefty personal fine. Elaine Stover, for her cooperation, got 5 years of probation. Brad, the fake security guard, was quietly fired and faced a separate misdemeanor charge for trespassing. But for me, the criminal justice part was only half the equation. The other half was about making things right. While the state handled the crimes, my lawyer filed a civil suit against the HOA as an entity. Their insurance company saw the writing on the wall. They knew a jury trial would be a slaughter. They settled quickly. The numbers were clean and undeniable. An independent appraiser valued the destroyed cabin, including the new solar array and other improvements, at $216,000. That was the first check the HOA's insurance had to cut. On top of that, the state's Civil Rights Division, in a separate action, fined the HOA $90,000 for its violation of fair housing laws. The financial blow was devastating to the HOA's bloated budget, a direct consequence of the liability Linda had created. The money was restitution, but it wasn't the victory. The real victory was the change that came after. With Linda and her cronies gone, the remaining homeowners were faced with a choice. Let the HOA dissolve into bankruptcy and chaos, or rebuild it from the ground up. To my surprise, they chose to rebuild. An emergency election was held. A retired accountant, a woman who had been shouted down by Linda for questioning the budget for years, was elected the new president. Mick was unanimously voted in as vice president. Their first official act was to call a public meeting, not in the sad little clubhouse, but outdoors, by the lake. The new board presented a completely revised set of bylaws. All enforcement actions would now require an independent, third-party inspection. No fines could be levied without photographic evidence and a certified letter sent to the homeowner. All board meetings would be recorded, and the audio posted on a new community website within 24 hours. They were replacing a system of petty tyranny with one of complete transparency. Several residents stood up during that meeting and apologized to me directly. They admitted they had seen Linda's behavior, that they had been afraid to speak up, and that they were sorry for their silence. There was no animosity, only a shared sense of relief, like a long fever had finally broken. It was in that moment that I knew what I wanted to do with the settlement money. Rebuilding my cabin felt different this time. It wasn't just my project anymore. Mick came over every morning with a thermos of coffee and his old tool belt. Other neighbors, people I barely knew before, would stop by. One guy, a former contractor, spent a whole weekend helping me frame the new walls. The woman who had been fined for her garden gnomes brought over lunch for the small crew every Saturday. We were building more than a house. We were rebuilding a community. With a portion of the settlement money, I bought a plot of unused common land from the restructured HOA. On it, Mick and I designed and built a large, sturdy community tool shed. We stocked it with everything a homeowner might need: ladders, lawnmowers, power washers, saws. Any resident could sign out a tool for free. It was a simple idea, a shared resource that fostered trust and cooperation. It was the exact opposite of everything the old HOA stood for. They thought tearing down my walls would break me, would drive me out. But they had miscalculated. The attack on my home hadn't isolated me. It had revealed the foundation of something much stronger. In the end, they didn't break me. They built a community around me. On the day we finished the new cabin, 6 weeks after the arrests, the new HOA president played an audio clip at the start of the monthly meeting. It was a recording of one of the old board members formally resigning. His voice was shaky, full of regret. "We failed," he said. "We failed to uphold the trust of this community. We let fear and ego guide our decisions, and for that, We are truly sorry. It was an acknowledgement, a final turning of the page. Later that evening, sitting on the deck of my new cabin, watching the sunset paint the lake with color, I finally felt the peace I had come back for. The ordeal had taught me a hard lesson. You can't control everything. You can't stop bad people from trying to do bad things. But you can document everything. You can build your case, brick by brick, fact by fact. And if you do that right, if you are patient, methodical, and relentless, you don't need to yell. You don't need to fight. You just need to press play.